Thank you for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Well, it is time for our monthly panel, and with us today we have the Honorable Joe Oliver. He is a former Minister of Finance as well as Minister of Natural Resources in the Harper government. And we also have the Honorable Sandra Pupatello. She is a senator from Ontario and a former Ontario Trade Minister. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Tony.
Great to be with you.
Sandra, we'll start with you. Obviously, even though we have a lot of Canadian news to cover, the big item on the agenda this week is President Trump's trip to China to have these consultations with Chinese President Xi Jinping. What do you think that means for Canada's interests, or what are your top of line observations about this visit?
Well, I'll be curious to see if they have any conversation around the auto industry, because it seemed to be quite after the fact, a bit of a pain point for them to hear of us discussing EV entrance from China into Canada. But if they in fact start having discussions around automotive, that could negate any problem they have with us. So that could be a good thing. It seems as though they're at least making it look like they're getting along. And frankly, I think Trump needs this because several of his other forays into world affairs, it's just not going well for him. And I think he needs to show that something could go right so that they can show some kind of a deal, like the Boeing deal, for example, that manufacturing is going to benefit because of this visit to China. So frankly, at this point, it looks like it's gone well for Trump.
Joe, do you have any top of mind thoughts about this?
Well, I think there are certain strategic vulnerabilities for Canada, depending upon where this goes and how concrete it is, aside from the optics and the marketing. For one thing, there's talk about canola and other agricultural products, which would be really directly competitive with Canadian interests. And then, of course, there's oil and gas, which hasn't been mentioned thus far, but you can understand why both countries might be potentially interested. The United States has become the largest producer in the world of oil and gas. And so they're looking for markets, and of course, China is looking for sources of supply. And here, Canada is sitting, waiting to get a pipeline to Tidewater. So that's one sort of set of commercial issues. Then there's the geopolitical question. To the extent this sort of formalizes a bipolar world, then Canada has no choice, no alternative but to side with the United States, which can constrain its agency and flexibility. And something I know that the Prime Minister has been railing against, but larger powers and bigger events can intervene. We just don't know yet. So I'm just issuing those two cautions, not making a prediction about it. But they are potentially very serious.
Joe, let's talk about the trade negotiations with the U.S. I mean, there's supposed to be a July 1st deadline to have these negotiations. So where are we? Are we getting closer to serious negotiations on USMCA CUSMA?
Actually, I don't know, because there are two contradictory narratives that have recently developed. I mean, the Canadians are saying that the Americans don't want to really start substantive discussions, and we're hearing from the Americans, including someone was telling me, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, saying that the Canadians won't start talking in any meaningful way at all. If the latter is the case, I think that would be a real strategic and tactical blunder. But I'm not saying it is. I just don't know. But we've got sort of both sides saying the other side won't begin negotiations. So how can the rest of us know where it stands? The only thing we do know is this is potentially of crucial importance to Canada. That doesn't mean we capitulate, but it does mean we've got to take this very seriously and stop talking about how we got to move away from the United States and stop trash talking, the U.S. relationship.
And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with our panel, the Honorable Joe Oliver and the Honorable Senator Sandra Pupatello. Sandra, right to you. What do you think the state of negotiations is or should be between Canada and the U.S. right now?
I do think the US is probably frustrated because we're just not caving like all those European countries and just throwing 10% or 15% on the table. Here, will you accept us paying 20% more? And that's what happened in those first instances. I was shocked. And of course, those countries don't have near the relationship with the US that Canada does. So no, we're not in a position to do that. And I think that's frankly what's so upsetting to them. They want us to extend an olive branch. We did that. We offered the digital sales tax on there, or the digital tax, removed it completely. What did we get for it? Really nothing.
Mm.
So we've kind of tried to do what they've suggested and it's gotten us nowhere. I do think that in more time, they'll see many examples of how we really need to work together. And ideally, this is softening how that negotiation can go. And I would not say they're not at it. I would say they are. It's just that we're just not caving like the rest of the countries are and suggesting that we're prepared to take whatever the Americans are willing to give us. And to be honest, I'm glad. I want to see us have a little bit of backbone. They're angry about the booze coming off their shelf. And I think how quickly they forget that the Americans started this war with their closest ally, and they're surprised somehow that we're upset about it. So
Mm.
it's a little bit galling to watch these guys reacting to Canada now when really they should just get to the table and realize how integrated our economy is. It isn't a trading nation with the US like the rest of the countries in the world. We are truly an integrated economy.
Joe, that's right. We are an integrated economy. So, are there certain things that we can say or do with the Americans that will open to a good and just trade deal?
Well, the logic is on side for a good trade deal for both of the partners. I mean, we've got a highly integrated supply, system, and it's clearly it's crucial for Canada, and it's extremely important for the United States. All the arguments are there. And I think we have to continue to raise them. Unfortunately, we're dealing with an administration that seems to love tariffs, or their own tariffs, but not ours.
Mm.
And we've got a Secretary of, I guess, Commerce, who said that Canada sucks because they have a trade deficit with us. Of course, the trade deficit is a result of our selling oil and gas to them at a price below international prices. So if they didn't buy it from us, they'd have to buy it from someone else less politically stable at a higher price. We're dealing, unfortunately, with I guess both a lack of understanding and a very a kind of a mercantilist philosophy now, which we hadn't encountered before. But the concern, that I have is it's not just this administration. I mean, it's a continuation of what's sort of been happening in a more dramatic kind of a way. That says, we have to try to diversify, but we also have to be realistic. I mean, we're not, you know, our geographic proximity is and the supply chain integration just doesn't permit us to reduce our economic relationship with the United States very much without
Mm.
extraordinarily negative circumstances. There's been a lot of talk, and the Prime Minister's been making a valiant effort, but there hasn't been too much concrete out of that. If you look, there's been a few trade deals, but not
Right.
that many, and the numbers, certainly the trade numbers, don't reflect anything fundamentally different going on.
Yeah, Sandra, let's at least start this conversation. As you know, Prime Minister Carney has done a lot of trips to European capitals, talk with European partners, talk about
Hmm.
somehow diversifying our trade relationships away from the USA, closer to Europe. I know we've only got 20 seconds left. We'll continue it after the break, but could you start the conversation on this? Is this a good idea?
Well, yeah, I was impressed with where he chose to go right off the bat when he did become prime minister. He went to the UAE. He went to some
Right,
very large sovereign funds, and it was almost like he was preparing for what was to come in his budget.
right.
And now, of course, in his update, where he's detailing the sovereign wealth fund and
Okay,
looking at where in the world.
hold on to that thought. I'm sorry, we got to take a commercial
Okay.
break, but well, I'll give you the floor right afterwards. We'll be back after these messages. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. Our special monthly guests are the Honorable Joe Oliver and the Honorable Senator Sandra Pupatello. Sandra, I had to cut you off there, but you were getting
Yeah.
revved up to talk about the Sovereign Wealth Fund and basically the strategy of the Prime Minister to diversify our economy. Please continue.
Well, I do think that long term, no one can doubt the importance of the American trade relationship with us, because you're right. Companies will go where it's easiest, and it's a lot easier when you're just south of the border as opposed to across the ocean. And we know that in our experiences in government, that it's really hard to move trade east and west. It's just much easier going north and south. Um, in any event, we've got to build. We've got to use our own money to build projects and start generating economic advancement because of it. And he's done that. The launch of the Sovereign Wealth Fund means that can use part of everybody else's money in Canada and bring that fund into our projects. There's a lot of talk about what else we could do in terms of using our own money, using our own pension funds, for example, in Canada. So I think we're ripe for that. We're just ripe for this kind of conversation, because we need to make up for whatever economic losses we're taking with the hits from the US at the moment. And ideally, that's not going to last forever. So in the meantime, let's use this time to build our infrastructure. All the projects they're selecting are projects that mean more economic independence for Canada. So I'm delighted with the ones they've selected for big projects. I'm delighted with the notion that even I, as an individual, could participate in a sovereign wealth fund. I feel like I'm helping my country with these projects. So I just think overall, he's moving in the direction that the American trade war has forced us to do things that might have taken us 10 years, and he's trying to do it in a year.
Joe Oliver, are you going to be opening up your checkbook for the Sovereign Wealth Fund? Please let us in on this.
No, I don't. I don't think so. Actually, look, we'll talk about that in a second. And I'll tell you why. But the sovereign wealth fund or sovereign debt fund is unlike, of course, the traditional sovereign wealth funds that you see in Norway or in Singapore. That those funds were generated by actual wealth. The revenue that came from the exploitation of oil and gas development created a huge surplus in Norway. They didn't want to overheat their local economy. They wanted to save money for the future. They put it aside, and it's been enormously successful. In fact, the number of dollars that they a profit last year in the Norwegian sovereign debt fund is equal to about 60% of Canada's expenses this year. Just to give you an idea of what a country, irrespective of how much they talk about being green, which develops their resources, can enrich their own society. But this is industrial policy writ large. It's stakeholder capitalism. It's corporatism. It's picking winners and losers by government in conjunction with capital and labor, taking into account regional and environmental considerations. It's government, greater government involvement in the economy. And when you have an investment vehicle that takes account of issues other than profit, it's going to affect the bottom line. And in a macro sense, that's precisely what's happened to Europe. They've adopted this kind of corporatist model, and they have fallen behind in the last 2 decades. In particular, They've fallen behind the United States in GDP growth and growth in GDP per capita very significantly. So is Canada for the same reasons. I fear this is simply more of the same.
Mhm. Yes. Well,
Well, I have to say,
Sandra, yeah,
having
please.
sat with sat with the sheiks in the UAE and other Arab countries, they look at who else is in this fund with me, and if they see the Canadian government is in, they're far more likely to also come in and participate. So, in my view, I thought it was clever because it shows that the Canadian government, they're putting their money where their mouth is, or our money where their mouth is, to say we're in for a little. We
Mm,
want you to join us, and then it
right.
looks like a very credible fund. You can't compare us to Norway. They are not nearly as reliant on the North American economy as Canada is. So the impact of Trump on Norway is infinitesimal by comparison. So,
Right.
yes, they have a lot of oil. Yes, they have a lot of wealth. God bless them for it. We're not in that position right now. We've got to get there. And I think these are the kinds of steps that any government, including Joe's government, would
Right.
say big projects that create investment is exactly what we
Right.
need right now.
Right. Sandra, we're
Yeah,
going to leave it at
but
that. I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it at that. We're going to take a short break. We can continue this discussion after these messages. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with our monthly panel, the Honorable Joe Oliver and the Honorable Senator Sandra Pupatello. Joe, you had a brief intervention from the last segment.
well, Sandra was suggesting that our government would favor this plan. She seems to have some insight into our thinking that I don't necessarily share. I mean,
This is the Harper government. Yeah, yeah.
we this is the Harper government. We would favor private capital developing these resources, and there's an economic case for that. Unfortunately, there's been regulatory and political impediments to doing it, and now as Gwyn Morgan has said, there's a huge reluctance on the part of the private sector to pour more money in because of the regulatory and political risk. I mean, the government has to get in. It's not the government has to do more. The government has to get out of the way and signal clearly that it's going to stay out of the way.
Mm.
That's my brief comment on that.
Kind of, it reminds me of 2008 when the government of the day actually to come in and bail out Chrysler and GM. You remember those days, Tony? I think you and I
I
did it
do.
actually. So yeah, when the government needs to get involved, they actually do it, including the Harper government, because they worked with the Ontario government in those days to save those two
Sure.
companies.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
and of course now
saving
we're
that's
led
right.
to
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, well,
So
I was
they
there
saving
for
the
do
that.
two
get involved.
companies,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
was the
They
right
do
thing
get
to do.
involved when they have to.
Yeah.
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 Well,
Well,
that's
let's.
right.
Private
When
capital
you
wasn't coming in
precise,
then,
well,
Joe.
just a second, let me finish precisely when they have to, and when they should, and
Right.
they did have to then. This isn't
That's
some
right.
pure Ayn Rand thing. When they have to, they do. But
That's right.
they didn't
Well, I
have
hate
to
to call you on
because they
it, but
didn't
yeah,
have
they
to
did
put.
have
If I
to.
can continue, they didn't have to impose, and they didn't impose regulatory impediments, and
Right.
that's the lost decade.
Sure. And then we do have
Oh
to talk
my
about that.
God.
But I do, Sandra, I do
Yeah.
want to talk to you about Honda because I know you've got some
Mhm.
expertise in this area, but they announced recently they are definitively halting plans for a $15 billion electric vehicle investment in Alliston, Ontario, citing lower demand. So what does this say about government efforts to save and enhance the auto sector, do you think?
Well, I do think that that Honda announcement, it's happening all over North America. Mexico is being impacted, so is America. There are plants that have lots of capacity right now because the volumes just are not there on these EV products. So when companies like Honda had an opportunity to say we're going to invest to create more capacity, they're reading the writing on the wall and saying there's overcapacity right now in North America. This is not the time to build a new plant, which is very unfortunate because they've got a fantastic facility in Alliston, and a doubling that would have been fantastic. I'm hoping that over time that EV market will improve, the demand will increase, and it means Honda and the Honda Civic has always won many awards, let alone done really well in sales. So that this will still come at some point. They own property there. As I said, they have a great team that runs a fantastic facility, and it may come back when the EV market improves. And the same is true with Brampton and Stellantis and what was happening there. They hadn't gone ahead with their investment with what was going to come, that again was destined for the EV market. And if the market's not there, why are companies going to choose to make another investment when they all have major capacity issues? We're getting the hit because, frankly, everybody was selecting Ontario, which I think speaks well of our environment
Right.
to make those investments. So we're getting the hit because that's where the investments were going. And I think the EV market has to turn around. And when that demand goes up, they're going to be looking at us again.
Joe, is this EV market overhyped?
No kidding. I mean, this is a reality check when socialism's obsession with green energy is mugged by the market. That is to say, consumers who don't want it. That's the liberals have totally misjudged, and the Democrats in the states and many of the governments in Europe have misjudged or chosen to be
Yeah.
blind, deliberately blind to
You know,
consumer
And we do have to leave
reluctance.
it at that. Unfortunately, it's interesting you didn't mention the Ford government, but I'll just leave it at that. We'll come back with a wonderful panel next month. Thanks for being on our show today. Thank you for joining us today.